So pivot tables and the design tab and a few miscellaneous kind of topics. We're going to first begin with the design tab in the layout group, and then look at the pivot table style options group, and then the pivot table styles group on the design tab. Then we're going to build a frequency distribution. We'll look at multiple aggregations, which are easy to set up. We'll apply some conditional formatting to the pivot table. We'll look at the resolution to a grouping issue, and we'll set up a slicer to control more than one pivot table. So I've got a worksheet set up with our data that sort of keeps growing over time. I've now added a state for each of the sales that took place by the salespeople. I have the dollars, I have the discount percentage, so that we can build a pivot table and look at some of the design tab options. So I'm going to build a pivot table by first selecting the cell in the data region, going to the Insert tab, left-clicking Pivot Table in the Tables group, and left-clicking Insert into the existing worksheet in cell K6. So what I want to do is have a pivot table that shows the salesperson's sales broken out by the state for the gross amount of the sale. And because we can, I'm going to reformat the values to show as currency, since that's what it is. Going to the Design tab, the first group is the Layout group, and the first set of options we have is to include subtotals or not. And if we include subtotals, we can choose as to where we want to have those subtotals displayed. We can toggle the subtotals off completely. We can show them at the bottom of the group, which may be preferable for a lot of people, or we can show them at the top of the group, which is the way they show by default. Next, we can insert some grand totals or not. We can turn the grand totals off for both columns and rows. We can turn them on for columns and rows, and currently I don't have a grand total that's displayed for the rows. It's just for the column. And although this is going to make the pivot table a little bit bigger than I want for it to be, in order for this pivot table to total up for rows, you've got to have different categories defined for it to total up. We have 3 product lines, so I'm going to grab the product line field and drag it down to the column labels drop zone, and now I do have a grand total for my rows and my columns. I can keep the grand totals for the rows that I just created by showing those grand totals only, or show them only for the columns. The next set of options is the report layout. We have 3 options when it comes to showing the report. We can show it in the compact form, which is what we currently are displayed in. We can show it in an outline form, which sort of moves the columns around. So instead of the salesperson being in the same column with the list of states, it's in its own column. This layout option may be preferable because it visually displays the different levels of aggregation, showing each one in their own column. And the third option we have is to show it in a tabular form, which is similar to the outline form, except the data is condensed a little bit. The outline form shows the subtotals at the top, and the tabular form shows them at the bottom. And it moves the list of states within each salesperson up to be aligned with the name of the salesperson. We also have the option to repeat all item labels, or we can have the item labels not be repeated, which is the default. And finally, we can insert a blank line after each item, which may improve the readability, or we can choose not to do that, which is the default. The next group, pivot table style options, have to do with the visual display of the pivot table and the formatting of the cells that contain the pivot table. So we can unhighlight the row headers or highlight them. We can unhighlight the column headers or highlight them. We can insert banded rows or not, or we can insert banded columns or not. And in the next group, the pivot table styles group, we can page down through the styles or launch the entire gallery. And when we hover over any of these options, we get a preview of what it's going to do to our pivot table, which is kind of nice. And like the other style galleries, we can create our own custom style for pivot tables and set our custom style as the default if we want to. Cancel out of that. And we can right-click any one of these styles and set it as a default as well. I'm going to click off of that and select the pivot table by going to the Options tab in the Actions group, select the entire pivot table, and I'm going to delete it because we're going to create another pivot table. I'm going to scroll back up. We're going to select another data point in the data region, insert pivot table on the existing worksheet in cell K5. And I'm going to scroll up again. And this time I want to sum the number of sales for each state. So I'm going to left click the state, which is going to automatically add that field to the drop zone row labels. And then I can left click any value which Excel is going to sum. And that's not really what I want to do. Since I want a frequency distribution, I want to summarize the values by counting them. And with the pivot table selected, I can insert a pivot chart and get a frequency distribution of the sales for those 10 states. I'm going to select that chart and delete it, pressing delete. I can also add the discount field more than one time in the values drop zone so that I have a count, I can have an average, and I can have the maximum, for instance, and separately format those fields so that in the case of percentage, we have the percentage showing. So this way you can do multiple aggregations on the same field. You can also insert some conditional formatting with, for instance, data bars on the pivot table. And if I change my aggregating method to sum, although that wouldn't make sense, the data bars change accordingly. So the data bars are truly conditioned to format the cells on the basis of the content in the pivot table. I'm going to Control Z to undo that. Select the pivot table by going to the Actions group in the Options tab, select the entire pivot table and delete it. And we're going to create yet another pivot table, selecting the data in the region, insert pivot table on the existing worksheet in cell K6. This time I want to show the sales by salesperson, broken out by state for the total amount of the sale, so that we can talk about some grouping issues. So the next thing I want to do is make a copy of this pivot table. So I'm going to select one of the cells on the pivot table, left click select, left click entire pivot table, Control C, go over to cell N6 and Control V, and I've got a copy of the pivot table. So if you watched the last movie, the prior movie, you know that we can group some of these items on the pivot table. I can group a number of states by selecting them, holding down the Control key to select non-contiguous states, at least as far as the list is concerned, and I can hold down the Shift key and select a contiguous range of states, and then go to the Options tab and left-click Group Selection. So what just happened? Both of the pivot tables reacted to the setup of the group because they're both being drawn from the same cache file. So while generally that's a good thing because you don't want to increase the number of your cache files, especially if you're dealing with a large amount of data, when it comes to grouping, it's not such a good thing. So how do we deal with this? How do we fix this? So the way to solve this problem is to create two named ranges, both of which refer to the data. So I'm going to press Control A to select all the data, go into the name box, and put in a name, Data 1, enter. And with the data still selected, I'm going to put in another name, Data 2, and enter. And of course, we could have done the same thing by converting this data to tables. But now I can select the second pivot table, go to the Options tab, left-click Change Data Source, change it to Data 2, which was the second name we gave to our data, left-click OK, and I can ungroup the group I created and it affects only that pivot table and not the other. So finally, I'm going to create another pivot table by selecting a cell in the data region, going to the Insert tab, Pivot Table, on the existing worksheet, scrolling up and choosing cell L5. I'm going to build this one by summarizing the sales by salesperson, by product line, giving me the sum of the gross price, and of course I'm going to have to move the product line field over to the row labels field. Now I'm going to select the entire pivot table, Control C to create a copy of it, go over a column and Control V so that I have a copy of that pivot table. Readjusting the column widths. I'm now going to insert a slicer by going to the Options tab and choose a field like Date. With the slicer selected, I can go to Pivot Table Connections and connect that slicer to both pivot tables. Left-clicking OK, so that when I make a selection choice on the slicer, and I'll hold down the Shift key after selecting January 3rd and run my selections to February 5th, the slicer choices actually affects the filtering of both of these pivot tables. They happen to be the same. They're the same content, but they don't have to be. If there's a field that's common to both data sets, and that field is called Date, you can connect the slicer to both pivot tables, and when you filter on a given date range or a given date, that filter will apply to both of your pivot tables. So that was the pivot table design tab and some miscellaneous topics when it comes to pivot tables. We looked at the layout group in the design tab that gave us options to control subtotals, grand totals. We could control the report layout, and we could also insert a blank row in between each of the items. The design tab also gave us some options as to the display of the headers and the columns, and we have a pivot table styles gallery that gives us a lot of preset options as to how we want our pivot table displayed. And we can even create our own custom style and save that and even use that as a default style. We then built a frequency distribution, and then we aggregated a field multiple times by adding it several times to the values drop zone. We applied some conditional formatting to the pivot table, and we talked about a solution to a grouping issue whereby when you group some items on a pivot table, if there's another pivot table pointed to that same data source, that pivot table will also be grouped accordingly. And finally, we linked up a slicer to more than one pivot table.